One of the major criticisms about the film actually had nothing to do with 7/7 directly. It was about when I was giving the prelude to the Soviet-Afghan War and a bit about the New World Order. And it was this part where I said communist regimes, the Bolshevik Revolution, had actually been funded by capitalists, and this got under quite a lot of people's skin. But in all the research I've done, it's pretty much an established fact on the record. I think the problem comes from when people don't understand why capitalists would fund communist regimes, and then they dismiss the information because capitalism is supposed to be the polar opposite of communism. You know, communism is this uprising of the lower classes against the ruling classes, and later on capitalism itself. I think an easy way to explain where I'm coming from would be to put yourself in the shoes of an elite New York banker. If you put yourself in their shoes, if you're a Rockefeller or a Morgan, and you've got a stranglehold over the US economy, you're going to start looking further afield at potential threats, at countries that might get the free market and end up wrestling you for your power. You're going to start looking for potential threats to that power, and at that time Russia was one of those potential threats. So if you're in those elite bankers' shoes, what are you going to do? Are you going to let this giant nation, bigger than the US, become a free market monster? You know, are you going to let it muscle in onto your turf? Or are you going to help send it down a different path? The path of communism. A path where everything is tightly controlled and land and capital is shared out equally, so you can't get any competition gaining more capital than anybody else. You would send it down that path of communism. And under communism, Russia became a captive market, while the banksters of New York and so forth could carry on and do their evil deeds elsewhere in the world, without having to worry that Russia could develop into a free market and then eventually a monopoly that could pose a threat to their system they'd already put in place in the Western world. Now, this doesn't mean the elite was some kind of secret communists. You know, when they push for socialism in America and Britain today, it's not because they're socialists, it's because it helps stifle competition and consolidate power. And so during the Bolshevik Revolution, their ideology was still the opposite of communism, but just like radical Islam, they used communism as a tool as well for their own agenda. As long as it doesn't go too far, and, you know, to the point where the world becomes one massive communist state or one massive Islamic state, the Western elite stays safe and they can keep practicing their monopoly version of capitalism in their home countries, because communism or Islam hasn't encroached to that point. And this brings me to some questions people have been asking about Operation Gladio. You know, how can they be staging terrorist attacks and blaming it on communists if they secretly funded the communists? Well, the answer to that's quite simple. As I've been saying, they've been using communism as a tool. They don't actually want it to go so far that it takes over the world or becomes a threat to their current system. So they also need to demonize communism and paint it in a bad light so that it doesn't progress beyond a manageable point, and so they can keep it in a captive form in a holding pot. And of course, when we talk about the elite, we're not talking about whole governments. There's elements of compartmentalization. You know, to the majority of people, when we were fighting communism, we were fighting communism. They didn't know that it was secretly funded by the elite. So there's all sorts of different factors that play into this. In some parts of the world, the elite don't want communism at all, because they might already have business dealings there. They might already have a monopoly over the resources, so they don't want, that all being taken away under a communist regime. But back to the Bolshevik Revolution. The clip I used in the film probably wasn't the best clip to use. It was taken from the Ring of Power documentary, and that basically makes the case that the Wall Street funded communism to get, people like Lenin in debt, so that he would have to answer to them. Well, I don't particularly buy that, because Lenin just said, sod off, I'm not going to pay you. It wasn't necessarily about wanting the money back. The money had been put to good use in sparking the revolution and creating the regime. It was the regime they wanted because it put Russia in a captive state. It wasn't about having, Lenin or whoever under their full control. It was just about the regime. The book you should all read on this subject is Anthony C. Sutton's Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. He had access to State Department files, personal documents, all sorts of information. It's a scholarly work, basically. And it's a fact, Wall Street did fund these things. And I hope the way I've explained it has answered your questions. I mean, it doesn't necessarily make being a leftist wrong, or believing in the pure form of communism. It doesn't make that wrong, exactly. I mean, depending on where you are geographically, rising up and taking back control from the current tyranny is probably quite an honourable thing to do. But you just have to be aware that powerful people can foresee these things, these revolutions happening, and they might help fund or manipulate them for their own gain. I made this point on the Freedomizer radio interview. I don't like Slobodan Milosevic any more than I like Saddam Hussein. But just like I didn't support the invasion of Iraq because it was contrived, the NATO bombing of Kosovo and that whole conflict was also contrived. Milosevic was brutal at times. He did have people assassinated. His army was vicious. But does that mean we bomb innocent people? Does that mean we have to make up propaganda because there isn't enough evidence against him? After his downfall, his people couldn't convict him because of a lack of evidence. So they sent him to The Hague instead to stand trial for war crimes, which, as Chomsky said in the clip in the film, these supposed crimes came after the NATO bombing, and there was no evidence for that. So strangely, he dies in his cell before the hearing. Milosevic's right-hand man, Radovan Karadzic, is on trial in the UN for war crimes against Muslims. But in a fair world, surely Tony Blair and George Bush should be joining him, because they have far more Muslim deaths on their hands than Karadzic does. And a lot of this is irrelevant. The point of the film was to show how our Western governments have funded terrorists on one hand and then started the war on terror with the other. This goes back to the question about Al-Qaeda. There's real radical Islam that is somewhat of a threat, and that is used as a tool by Western governments. And then there's the overhyped idea of Al-Qaeda, where all radical Islam is somehow linked to this one group, which is a lie because it doesn't really exist. This is the same with Bin Laden. There was a real Bin Laden who at times funded terrorism and who was a radical Muslim. He helped fund and trained elements of the Mujahideen, of course alongside the CIA. And then there's the fake media and government version of bin Laden, who is supposedly the head of a worldwide terrorist network, which is a lie. Now, bin Laden does have ties to people and groups here and there. He probably did have a hand in the US Embassy bombings, and probably did interact a bit with Muslims from the KLA. And even Harun Aswad may have been his bodyguard at some point. But then it's a ridiculous jump to claim bin Laden is responsible for every Muslim terror attack that ever happened. Since just after 9/11, where most evidence points to him being dead, the idea of bin Laden is just a massive psyop. All of the tapes are dodgy in some way. You know, many are just voice recordings. He comes out and talks about climate change, just ridiculous propaganda. Most of the tapes are either recuts or just completely fake. And this recent European terror plot is an example of a bin Laden psyop, where they claimed he signed off on the attack, like he's sitting in some cave version of the UN or the White House signing away on attacks all around the world. That's ridiculous. So yeah, bin Laden was a real person, and he did help fund terrorism, and does have ties with terrorists, but the media and Western governments have made him into something he definitely isn't. And of course there is some evidence to suggest that he worked very closely with the US, and even came to the US under the CIA alias of Tim Osman. Make of that what you will. The Jewish thing is quite interesting. There does seem to be a group of people that seem to want to blame everything on the state of Israel. And I'm no more a fan of the Zionist state of Israel than anybody else. They play a big role in the world's current corruption and the military-industrial complex and lots of other aspects to the New World Order agenda, if you will. But there's no more evidence of Israeli involvement in 7/7 than I've presented in the film, and that obviously shows that there's not actually any evidence at all that they carried out the attack. There is an element of prior knowledge with Benjamin Netanyahu getting a warning, but there's elements of prior knowledge within Saudi Arabia and the intelligence agencies as a whole. It doesn't suggest that Israel actually had any more involvement than anybody else, or any more knowledge. So you can't blame Israel or the Zionists in this case, and you shouldn't be blaming them without evidence in the first place. So that's really all I've got to say on the Jews doing it. If anybody else has any more questions or comments, leave them on the YouTube. Drop me an email, I'll try and answer them personally. But for now, that's about done with 7/7 The Big Picture. I hope you liked the film, I hope it was enlightening. No, I better retract that, people think I'm part of the Illuminati saying that. But hope you enjoyed the film, thanks for spreading it around, and I hope to see you next time when I'll be creating a... Well, it's not set in stone, but the next film I plan to make is called The Deficit Deception, or Deficit Disorder, something like that, explaining the UK debt crisis and who really owns the Bank of England and all that kind of thing. So we can try and get an end the Bank of England movement like America has the end the Fed thing. So I hope to see you there.